For a while now, the biggest issue around the world is climate change. The idea is that the globe has got a lot warmer, but sometimes it also gets too cold when it's not expected to. We don't know exactly what's happening. If you're a layman like me, we don't know. Well, that's the question we're going to be discussing today. And what's in this for Africa? And for Nigeria especially, which is our main concern. Of course, Nigeria, our mainstay as an economy is fossil fuel, crude oil, something we extract from the ground. The world says it is dirty, it has polluted so many places and so on. And the world wants to move to what's called cleaner energy. However, two things. Do we suspend our own development? What do we do with all of these resources we have in the ground? And in fact, what is called clean energy in some parts is also not so clean. For example, extraction of lithium and all the other aspects like zinc and coal that goes into making batteries, for example, leads to excavation of many lands and devastation of many environments around the world, perhaps again in Africa. Is Africa going to just continue being the part of the world that people come to exploit and explore? Sometimes I do argue that, look, I don't quite believe that Africa is where all the resources of the world are. Perhaps Africa is the part of the world that is most examined, exploited, researched. Most other parts of the world, especially the developed world, will not let you know what they have in the ground. But here is where we just tap everything from the ground. Which way forward? So the world has been discussing some of these issues for a while, and Nigeria has had to push back, especially when they wanted to classify gas as part of fossil fuel, and they wanted to start defunding gas exploration and production. The former Vice President, Yemi Osinbajo, was one of the few people who actually wrote very forcefully against that, and I think the thinking has changed in that regard. And then, of course, what's climate finance? You've been hearing about climate finance. What's it all about? They said it's also the next biggest thing. What's in it for Nigeria? What's in it for Africa? How do we get into the action? How do we think for ourselves? And how do we assure our development in the long run? Joining me today, Mr. Jide Olutoke from the United States, North Carolina, and he's a climate expert and public affairs commentator. Welcome, Jide.
And it's nice listening to what we've been doing in Nigeria, and I'm happy to also contribute my quota to that.
Fantastic. So you heard some of my introductory. So what exactly is this climate change palaver, if I ask you? For example, I know that sometimes people say, oh, it's got too warm. But I think every year there's a peak where things get too warm, and every year there's a point where things get too cold. And human beings, I want to believe that psychologically speaking, when it gets to that point, we tend to complain. And then things become average. We don't actually notice that for most part of the year, the weather is just okay. Wherever it is you are, whether you are living abroad, sometimes it's cold but not too cold, it's warm but not too warm. Then it gets to the peak. And it's that peak that we start to hear, oh, the world is going on fire. But then also, sometimes we get too much snow in some parts of the world. And then they still find a way to complain that, oh, something is melting somewhere. What exactly, can you educate us what exactly is going on?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I mean, I did econ in my undergrad, but I could at least give some idea to the science of climate generally. So I think the way to describe it is the world is like a balloon, and naturally we needed the greenhouse gas to actually keep the world warm. So one of the major catalysts to that is actually carbon methane. And then as we increase our level of carbon in the atmosphere, the world gets warmer. And then, of course, we can do a lot of things like agriculture. However, over the last couple of years, in the last like 5 decades or so, there is an increase in level of carbon that we have in the atmosphere, and then that keeps the environment changing. So it gets warmer, which is the idea of global warming. However, how does that actually affect the way we do our things? If you remember our secondary school textbook of what is climate, we're talking of 35 years change in climatic environment and things like that. The weather changes in 35 years or so. However, what we have right now is the fact that if you understand the way the geography works, we have the Arctic cycle, we have the Antarctic cycle, then we have the tropics of Cancer and the equator. Over the last 1 million years, we've had this Arctic cycle being frosted with highs and everything. So the sea level has been constant. I mean, has been increasing, but not on a gradual level. But in the last 50 years, as we're increasing our level of carbon in the atmosphere, the world gets warmer, and then the highs in the Arctic cycle actually start melting. And when that happens, the sea level starts rising. That is the impact on sea level. On the other side, the temperature in itself also changes. So we're talking of the Horn of Africa today, which is like Somalia, like Djibouti, like Kenya. With the increase in temperature, we can see the increase in desertification.
Okay.
The desert is actually encroaching more on the countries, and then a lot of people who can, let's say you plant your maize and you plant your cassava across a period of time. With this happening, it has changed the way we do our things, and then that also affects our productivity. So generally, while I'm not a climate scientist, I'm majorly from the climate finance end. What we've seen so far from the experts is the fact that our environment is changing. Let's pick Nigeria, for example. Last year, we had this really the biggest flooding ever in the history of Nigeria. I know some people will say, oh, what happened was because Cameroon opened their dam. But why did Cameroon open the dam? It's only because there's an increase in the river Benue actually got flooded, because there's an increase in rainfall. So what we are talking about right now is climate change is not just basically affecting, it's actually affecting our way of life, our culture. Some people have been along the Niger Basin over the last 1 million years, 2,000 years, doing farming, doing agriculture. If this continues to change, that changes our culture and our way of life, and then we need to start redesigning our policies to that effect.
Well, okay, but well, I read somewhere that since they started keeping the record of climate since the beginning of the first industrial revolution in 1750, the claim scientifically is that the world or the globe has warmed up by 1 degree centigrade. 1 degree centigrade. However, I felt, okay, how accurate is those records, especially in the earlier part of time of this record keeping in 1750? And we're talking of 1 degree centigrade. But I also understand that, look, if the world got warmer by 2 degrees centigrade, maybe we may not be able to live in this world anymore. You know, I don't know if you're aware of that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say maybe a bit too extreme to say that we won't be able to live at the world when it's 2 degrees. There was a research by William Nordhaus that actually even projects with 3.5 degrees. But yeah, going back to what you said, you were right. Up until, I think, before the Industrial Revolution, we've kept below 1 degree. But in the last 50, 70 years, I think, I'm not particularly sure of the numbers now, we've actually had a really increment in our, the aim is to ensure that we keep our temperature below 2.0 C or reasonably 1.5 C. And as much as I want to discuss this, I think majorly what that happens to us is the fact that when the environment gets warmer, as I said earlier, a lot of things changes. Flooding increases, we see droughts. I mean, you know this very well. If you look at what's happening in the Great Green Wall, along Sokoto Basin, we can see that the desert is actually encroaching. And that goes back to what happens to climate. If we don't have a change in environment or change in weather, most of these things that we're actually experiencing will not be happening. So for me particularly, because I've been in this space for the past 2 years, I've seen a lot of research that shows scientifically proven that this is actually really happening. I've actually witnessed one. I mean, in the US today, Miami, Florida is getting flooded. We saw what happened in New York a couple of days ago with the wildfire coming from Canada. That is also one of the impacts of climate change. So it's not only just affecting Africa, it's affecting the whole global world. So I think the earlier we as a country get to be involved in this conversation, and we don't want to be a spectator, because if you look at what happened with the Bretton Woods system, for some of us who are in the economist world, the Western world sat down, decided on how things should be done, but we're moving to a new space of finance in such a way that decisions are going to be made for us. If we don't get ourselves outrightly involved, then we can end up being spectators in the whole climate finance space over the next couple of years.
Fantastic. In the year 2016, I happened to be in Zambia at the African Development Bank meeting, and there was a very bitter argument between Akumi Adesina and a certain American lady. And the argument was, the lady was pushing for Africa to jettison all of its, call it fossil fuels, be it coal, petroleum, crude oil, and what have you, and to move to green energy already. And she was saying it very matter-of-factly. However, Adesina was of the opinion that that was wrong. And he mentioned the fact that America, including also Europe, and of course Asia, were still using their coal. And he doesn't understand why Africa will be told to stop using its coal, especially because we are lagging behind in the game of development. Of course, after Russia invaded Ukraine, the entire Europe went back fully into coal. And of course, the price of petroleum went up again because crude oil came back into demand, especially after COVID. And of course, 70% of crude oil is used for transportation to move things around, given the fact that, so it's a double-edged question, given the fact that, crude oil is mostly used for petroleum and all of that, and that's what we have. And green energy cannot as yet power heavy industries or even power ships or planes. There's no big plane that is running on green energy for now. Perhaps it's still going to be some way off before a plane can take off based on solar energy and land where it's supposed to land. My question then is, what is in it for Africa, for Nigeria? Should we jettison all of these things, or should we go back to even our coal that were abandoned in Enugu, which is supposed to be part of our energy mix, especially now that we have a new government and we know what our challenges are? That's one. And of course, when is it that green energy is going to be able to catch up with heavy industry and the kind of manufacturing plants that we need in Nigeria, in Africa? Not to talk of things like ships, like trains, like planes, and so on.
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic you've mentioned, and to be honest, it's a lot of issues going on right now. I mean, you're right about what's going on with the EU after Ukraine. Even I think at some point, EU decided to classify natural gas as green, which some climate scientists or some climate environmentalists kicked against that. And that brought us to the conversion of just energy transition partnerships, which, I don't know if you are aware of this, South Africa was the first country in the world that got the Jet Peace partnership from a lot of IPJs. So the idea is Africa as a continent, or even the whole developing country, we cannot just abandon, we cannot just say, oh, we're stopping the use of fossil energy right now. But the question is, how can we ensure that these countries transition in such a way that it's not going to affect their economy? Because look at China today. China 40 years ago is a developing country. I mean, it's still developing, right? But over the last 25, 30 years, they were able to push the economy forward based on using fossil energy, same as most of the countries in the developed world. However, the question is, and I think we use this example a lot in Nigeria with respect to communications, how Nigeria was able to springboard. We didn't have fiber optics like other people have in other parts of the world, and we're able to springboard that process in such a way that we actually have communications in Nigeria being done ahead of, we moved to cellular phones, even when we don't have a wider spread of fiber optics cable. So the question is, can we actually springboard this process? I think so. As it's talking about around shipping and aviation, what we have today, there's a lot of investments around green hydrogen that can actually power heavy-duty machines like ships, and then we also have what we call the sustainable aviation fuel that can also power a lot of long-haul flights. And for short-haul flights, like let's say from Lagos to Abuja, there's a lot of technology around for Boeing, and then these guys are actually bringing things that can actually develop electric plane that fly for just 1 hour, 2 hours. But going back to your question of what is in it for Africa, I think for me, the biggest problem I've seen, which is what I mentioned earlier, how the world finance was designed. In 1944-45 in Bretton Woods, as I mentioned earlier, we were not in the conversation. A lot of these things were done by developed countries, and then they decide how things to be done. I mean, look at what happened with the World Bank presidency that happened a couple of days ago. Most of us don't have a say in who actually gets picked as the World Bank president. So eventually the US decides who becomes the World Bank president, while the EU decides who becomes the IMF president. Climate finance is going to move towards that stage, right, in such a way that if we don't get, if you're saying this doesn't affect us, it is true. Africa contributes just 2% of the global greenhouse gas emission. But talking of vulnerability to climate change, Africa is going to be the most vulnerable to climate change. If you look at the top 10 cities in the world to be affected by climate change, Lagos is number 4 on there. Karachi, Philippines. You only have Miami, Florida as the only city in developed countries that's going to be affected by climate change among the top 10 cities. So the higher we understand, on the other side, most of these cities can actually build resilience. In Miami today, they are buying pump stations to pump the water back to the ocean. We don't have that kind of money to even do that in Nigeria and Lagos. So if sea level rise by 0.1 meter in Lagos today, the whole of Marina is gone. Or let's maybe 0.2 meters. So the earlier we plug ourselves in, I don't want us to be a spectator in this conversation in the next 20 years. If you look at, and then unfortunately for us, I mean, maybe for your generation, you won't be around in the next 50 years. We are almost going to actually give this environment to the children who are going to be born today. The question they're going to be asking us is, which I mean, I asked you this question is, when you were in university, you were having good food, the school fees was cheap. The question they're going to be asking us is, what did we actually do to actually mitigate or to actually reduce this risk? Because scientifically proven, this is actually true. If you all agree that COVID is real, I don't think we should also disagree that climate change is real as well. It is science, and if we agree to one science, then we can also agree that the other science is also real as well.
Okay, nice one. We're going to take a short break now. We've been speaking with Mr. Jide Olutoke, all the way from US, discussing this very, very important topic of climate change, climate finance, and what have you. Stay tuned. Welcome back to your show, The Nationalist, and we've been discussing with Mr. Jide Olutoke, a climate finance, climate change expert from the US, discussing about how this phenomenon affects us in Nigeria, in Africa at large, and of course, in the developing world. What is this an agenda being driven only by developed countries? Is it going to take away our opportunities to develop even if we had a chance? Where do we go from here? Welcome back, Jide. So we can continue the discussion. Thank you for your last delivery. That was spot on, and I can see that you're very much in the space. Now I'm going to shift to a related topic, climate finance. I've been hearing a lot about climate finance, climate finance. Oh, what are we financing, indeed? What is climate finance? What's it all about?
I mean, I think the easiest way to look at this is actually to break the words down into two, climate and finance. I mean, you're a finance expert, you've done that all your life, and then what we are saying is, how do we actually reconsider, how do we repurpose our financing for climate? And then let me add one thing for nature. Because we are looking at Africa today, most of our economy is being driven, if not from oil, employment is driven by agriculture. So nature, we are close to nature. We are close to either farming or fishing or livestock. So we are saying that we need to repurpose our finance in such a way that we could actually support farming in such a way that it is going to contribute to positive climate actions. And what we're talking about is, how do we ensure that the kind of fertilizer we use is not going to affect our water system? How do we ensure that the kind of farming, with the kind of pasture farming we're doing does not destroy the surface level? How can we ensure that the kind of planting we are doing, we don't need to cut our forests to actually plant our maize, to plant our beans? How do we ensure that we can actually replant our trees? So we're saying, and how do we even use what is under the soil? At this time, it's not oil, we're talking of carbon. So in Congo today, if you look at the Congo business, Congo is probably one of the biggest countries in the world that has the largest carbon peatland reserve in the world. So how do we ensure that these resources, even though it's not oil that could be extracted, we could actually quantify these resources in such a way that we can make money from it? So the idea is we need to repurpose our banks, commercial banks first and foremost, our asset managers, our pension fund, and then our development banks, domestically and internationally, to actually focus on climate and nature generally.
Wow, that's fantastic. But it seems as if climate finance, therefore, is trying to affect agriculture, trying to affect even banking, finance, perhaps with a finger in every pie. Are you sure you're not going to have some pushback from some of these sectors? If you're trying to kind of redefine the way all of them, they do their thing. Has there been any pushback in climate finance?
Yeah, totally. There has been a lot of pushback, and obviously, let's talk about banking in Nigeria, for example. I mean, you work in banking, and I work in banking for a bit of time, and we know that it's easier and it's faster for a lot of Nigerian banks to make money from treasuries and government bonds. It's an easy peasy money. And so when we're trying to repurpose financing to things that we actually maybe exert a lot of energy or influence from the banking system to do more of due diligence. And you can't blame the banks, to be honest. If I could make money from a T-bill at 11%, why should I want to invest in energy or invest in agriculture that's going to give me 7% and a lot of due diligence? But the question is, a lot of these times we probably focus more on the regulators, which is how we focus on our energy on. Most of the time, banks are designed to make profits. Banks are designed to actually maximize profits for their shareholders. It's a fiduciary responsibility of the banks to make money for their shareholders. How do we actually ensure that the guidance notes in the country from the SCC, from the CBN, actually encourages the banks to do that? If in Nigeria today, we don't have an enabling environment for the banks to actually invest into energy, then they won't put their money there. So I think generally, if a lot of things could change, and also not even putting all the blame on the national government. That is where, if you remember our conversation about DFIs, development finance, like World Bank, like IMF, like AFDBs, they have the capacity to actually take on the risk that is associated with climate change. We are talking of investing into things that has not been done before in Africa or in Nigeria. And Access Bank will not put its money there because Access Bank is a profit maximizing organization. For a World Bank, for an IFC, for an AFDB, who can shoulder the risk because their shareholders are not maximizing profit, they can take the first loss. They can take this particular this loss. So which is why we need to propose our multilateral development banks, our DFIs, to actually take on the risk that most of the commercial banks will not be able to take.
Last question. What do you think about the fact that we are also devastating our environment with the mining of lithium and all of that towards this green energy finance?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy you mentioned that.
In 1 minute, please,
honest,
if you can.
There was an article I wrote around that earlier in the past, and which is why, as countries in Africa, we need to stand up for ourselves. Lithium is being mined in Congo, silicon around the global world. That is why the AFCTA is a good instrument that we could use as an African continent to ensure that we can protect ourselves. I was in COP27 last year in Egypt, and then we set up what's called the African Carbon Markets Initiative, the ACMI. The ACMI could be a tool that we could use to prevent most of these countries from exploiting us. If Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Congo, we all come together, as it's like a broom, right? You use this scenario in Nigeria. When you bring all the brooms together, you can't break them, but when you use one single broom, you can break it. When all these countries actually come together as a unified force, then we can set up a standard and say, this is how we want you to explore the lithium. We can explore the lithium ourselves. We don't need to actually get a Chinese company or a US company to actually do that for us.
Thank you very much, Jide. This is as much as we can take today. I'll still have to call you back on another day so we can expand this topic. It's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much, Jide, and have a good day out there in the US.
Thank you so much. Have a good
Cheers.
one, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, viewers, for staying tuned so far. And it's been great. It's been a great time. See you next week.